This presentation is called China's Resources and Potentialities. Early in the 20th century, abdu'l-baha said, "China has the most great capability. The Chinese people are most simple-hearted and truth-seeking. Truly, I say, the Chinese are free from any deceit and hypocrisies, and are prompted with ideal motives. China is the country of the future." This remarkable statement was made at a time when China was in a period of decline, when it was struggling to establish a republic, when it was enduring the intrusion of the colonial powers from around the world. It would have been hard for most people to understand a statement like this. This statement was amplified and reinforced by his grandson Shoghi Effendi, who said that China, a land which has its own world and civilization, whose people constitute 1/4 of the population of the globe, which ranks foremost among all nations in material, cultural, and spiritual resources and potentialities, and whose future is assuredly bright. Again, another remarkable statement about the rich heritage which lies in the civilization of China. This presentation will attempt a quick look at China's material, cultural, and spiritual resources and potentialities, and then try to look at what these are for. So let's begin with part 1, a brief look at China's material, cultural, and spiritual resources and potentialities. What do we mean by material, cultural, and spiritual? My understanding from abdu'l-baha is that the material and spiritual aspects of civilization are like two wings on a bird. Both are needed for progress and development. The expression of the spiritual in the material world is done by the wise and the cultured. The translation of the spiritual principles and concepts into the material world become visible in the form of laws, regulations, arts and sciences. These are the outcome of the efforts of the wise and cultured applying lofty ideals in the material world. China, in all of these aspects, is, according to Shoghi Effendi, foremost. There isn't time in this presentation to cover all the aspects of that abdu'l-baha describes, but if we look at material and cultural civilization, he, in his definition, he includes things such as physical accomplishments, perhaps great engineering projects, building cities, etc. It includes laws and regulations, arts and sciences, and government. These are some of the material expressions of spiritual resources. In this presentation, I'd like to focus on just a smaller group, look at arts, sciences, and government. That will be followed by a look at spiritual resources and potentialities. Beginning with the arts of China, I'd like to show that through a quick series of slides which are showing mostly artifacts from different eras, going back as much as 4,000 years ago. Here, the first picture is a bronze ritual vessel from the Xia dynasty. The next picture is from the Shang dynasty. This is a very vigorous mask, bronze mask. Here's a model built in the present day of an idea of an ideal city described in the Zhou dynasty, with walls with gates and temple-like structure in the middle. It was a metaphor of and a device for helping establish harmony between heaven and earth. The throne of the emperor surrounded by a protective city ruling over the empire. Here is a Han Dynasty figurine, another Han Dynasty figurine, active, dynamic, creative. Here's some brick relief carving. Moving on in time, as Buddhism came to China, we can see examples of very beautiful Buddhist-inspired art. These are statues of the Buddha, and when you see them, you can feel that these were made by God-intoxicated disciples who were very much in love with what they were doing and trying to express their lofty ideals. This next figurine from the Tang dynasty is of actually a foreign merchant with his big nose and beard. These are not Han characteristics. The Tang city, capital city of Chang'an, was a very international, cosmopolitan city for its day. Delegations coming from Japan, Korea, from the Middle East. Here's a sketch plan and section are made of a Tang Dynasty pagoda that's still in Xi'an today. Here's the Dunhuang Caves in Gansu Province. Have these beautiful wall paintings, murals, with incredibly subtle colors. This is an analysis of those colors. The main colors from each painting are abstracted and then assembled in this next image. You can see them in a spectrum, red, orange, yellow, etc. pattern, and it's a beautiful palette of very sophisticated color. Here's some handwriting of Li Bai, one of China's beloved poets. China is a civilization where even the handwriting is an art form. Here's a Song Dynasty vase and painting and sculpture, a Buddhist statue from the Song Dynasty. Moving on to the Yuan Dynasty, these are the days when Marco Polo visited China. A Yuan Dynasty mural painting. Here's a Ming Dynasty temple that's clinging to a cliff face. And finally the Qing Dynasty, the last of the major dynasties, the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. Since I'm an architect and planner, I'm very interested in looking at the urban planning and city building activities of China's civilization. Here we have the city of Beijing, which is an expression of that earlier Zhou dynasty concept of the walled city with a sacred place in the middle, the 12 gates, etc. And this expression of that idea, built in the Ming Dynasty much later, but still following this old concept. There's a wall, there's a north-south central axis, there's the emperor's throne in the middle. He's facing south, he is facing the sun, the symbol of heaven, and is reflecting its light to his people on earth. The whole construct, the whole city, is a metaphor of the emperor and his role of linking heaven and earth. Distributed around the city are temples, earth, sun, heaven, moon, which are places where the emperor would go to pray for good harvests. Since it's an agricultural economy, obviously it's very important to have good harvests, and people were relying on the emperor to help ask for and receive the benefits of heaven. This form of an axis, a wall, a point of importance in the middle, is repeated in the Forbidden City. It's like a model of the larger scale reduced to the scale of the Forbidden City. And then even inside that, if you look, it's called the Five Colors Earth Temple. It's the same thing again, a wall with a north-south axis, a place of stillness, of honor and power, facing south. In the middle is the altar, an altar where ceremonies were performed to pray for good harvests. This pattern of a north-south axis and an important room or pavilion on that axis, surrounded by a wall, is the essence of a courtyard house as well. This slide shows a series of these courtyard houses arranged on Hutong streets. I used to live in this neighborhood, and each courtyard house was the place for an extended family, and the patriarch of the family, Grandpa, was the equivalent in a sense of the emperor on his throne. And you had this hierarchy of authority, this model of the universe atomized in fractal-like fashion right down to the grassroots of the society. So there's a common understanding pervading the whole. Here's another view of a courtyard house. The yellow room is Patriarch's room, and in that room there is a kind of an altar where homage is made to the ancestors, which then links the present to the past. This axis is so important. It's still important today, and it was extended to the north and became the main axis of the site for the 2008 Olympics. It's interesting that the slogan, the theme of the Olympics was "One World, One Dream." So you still had this continuation of a sacred axis reaching out into the future with a spiritual theme of world unity. So that was a quick look at the arts of China. It's some of the resources and potentialities of the arts of China. If we have a look at the sciences next, the next two slides are charts which show various aspects of Chinese science and technology, such as agriculture, astronomy, engineering, etc. They're in groups as you go down. Vertically, the lines are timelines from the left 1000 BC over to the right 1500 AD, And each horizontal line represents an invention. For example, under agriculture, the second line from the top, there's the iron plow. And you can see about 600 BC it was invented, and then about 16 or 1700 AD it arrives in the West. So it took more than 2,000 years for it to migrate to the West, etc. All the horizontal lines here, the colored bars, represent the time lag for the invention in China to move to the West. The next page has a similar kind of list with including medicine, mathematics, magnetism, physical sciences, etc. Some specific examples of Chinese inventions include the decimal system, the compass, paper, explosives, the wheelbarrow. Even in music, Chinese prince invented the tempered scale, and this was used by Johann Sebastian Bach in 1722 in his music. In the area of shipbuilding, for example, the bottom left-hand corner is a large ship, 440 feet long, and this was the ship of Zheng He, a mariner who made long trips from China all the way to Africa, going around India in the early 1400s. His ship, actually a fleet of ships, had compartmentalized hulls, so if one part was punctured it wouldn't sink. It had a deep rudder and a keel. It had sails that could be turned into the wind, so that tacking into the wind was much easier to do than the square sails such as you see on Columbus's ship, that smaller one with the red sails. With square sails with the wind pushing from the back, it was more difficult. You had to tack in a much wider fashion when you're going into the wind. And the next slide is showing the path of several trips that Zheng He made to Arabia and Africa. These were voyages of exploration. He didn't go to various places and stick flags in the ground claiming the land for China. They were exploratory trips. So those are some examples of a glimpse of Chinese invention and science up until about the year 1400. I'd like to read this quotation from Robert Temple's book, The Genius of China. He says, "It would be better if the nations and peoples of the world had a clearer understanding of each other, allowing the mental chasm between East and West to be bridged. After all, they are, and have been for several centuries, intimate partners in the business of building a world civilization. The technological world of today is a product of both East and West to an extent which, until recently, no one had ever imagined. It is now time for the Chinese contribution to be recognized and acknowledged by East and West alike. And above all, let this be recognized by today's school children, who will be the generation to absorb it into their fundamental conceptions about the world. When that happens, Chinese and Westerners will be able to look each other in the eye, knowing themselves to be true and full partners." The triangle below the quote is my attempt at making an illustration out of some of the points that Robert Temple was making in his book. He's saying that Chinese ideas and inventions were the foundation of the European agricultural revolution, which in turn was the background for the realization of the European industrial revolution, which in turn allowed the creation of modern science and technology. So these are integral steps in a process, and China is at the beginning of that process. There's a piece I would like to add to Robert Temple's model is the Chinese ideas and inventions were transmitted to Europe via Islam. The Islamic world is a vital link between China and Europe. Further on that theme, it's very interesting to see that 18 years after the Prophet's death, the Prophet Muhammad's maternal uncle was part of a delegation that came to the Tang Dynasty city of Chang'an and invited the Chinese emperor to embrace Islam. Even before the year 700, there were Islamic traders coming to southern China by sea. The city of Quanzhou in Fujian province, across the water from Taiwan, was a great center of trade around the year 1000, and a lot of Muslim people were arriving there. They built mosques. They were integrated into the administration of the harbor city. So there was a very strong Islamic link connecting China to the West. So that was a glimpse of China's scientific and technological resources, their contribution, their role in the overall material development of humanity. Of course, that potential and is still there, and it's reappearing today in a new form. Next, I'd like to have a quick look at government. Some aspects of governance in China include an unusually long duration. Chinese governance has had a moral foundation, includes respect for the learned, and had always one center in a hierarchical structure. I'd like to read this quote from Guns, Germs, and Steel by Mr. Diamond. He said that China was already unified politically in 221 BC. This was the Qin dynasty, a short-lived but a dynasty that succeeded in uniting a large area of China. And China has remained so for most of the centuries since then. From the beginning of literacy in China, it has had only a single writing system, whereas Europe, for example, uses dozens of modified alphabets. Of China's 1.2 billion people, over 800 million speak Mandarin, the language with by far the largest number of native speakers in the world. China has been Chinese almost from the beginning of its recorded history. We take this unity of China so much for granted that we forget how astonishing it is. There's nowhere else on earth that has achieved such a scale of political unity for such a long time. In the Qin dynasty, for example, we're talking 2,000 years ago, and it's a territory of about 3 million square kilometers. The European Union, with an area of about 4 million square kilometers, has only just recently come about as a political union. The United States is very young. The USSR only started to expand out of Russia in about the 1500s. It's after the colonial period that Africa is now able to talk about a Pan-African Union. So China was way ahead of its time in its experience of governance. A quick look at this phenomenon through a series of maps. The first one is about 4,000 years ago. We have the Xia dynasty, the beginnings of China, and then the Shang dynasty, followed by the Western Zhou dynasty and the Eastern Zhou dynasty. And then about the year 221 BC, the Qin dynasty unites various what had been more like separate states into one unified political body. Once this political union had been achieved, it has been basically sustained ever since. Here we have the Han dynasty, about 400 years duration, and the territory expanded a little more. Here's the Tang dynasty, about 300 years long. The long corridor reaching out to the west is the land link, Silk Road, that was the path by which the east and west of the day were linked together, in addition to the sea route to the south. China started to meet some resistance to its expansion in the Sung dynasty. Some northern peoples who actually by this time had adopted many Chinese ways, but were still independent peoples, were impinging on China's territory from the north. The Xixia and the Liao people were pressing down on the northern Song dynasty, and another people called the Jin succeeded in pushing the Han Chinese part of China to a much smaller area, and this was the southern Song dynasty. They had to move the capital to Hangzhou from where it was in Chang'an. Another group of northerners called the Mongolians, the Hmong people, they not only impinged on China, they took over. And so I've changed the color from yellow to this gray color, although it is still politically China, but now the ship of state has a new captain in the wheelhouse who is not Han Chinese. The captain or captains are Mongolians, but they very much adopted Chinese ways as much as possible and kept intact the Chinese political state. This is also called the Yuan dynasty period, and it's the time when Marco Polo visited China. He actually met with a Mongolian emperor, not a Han Chinese emperor. The Han Chinese took over China again. This is the Ming dynasty, a few hundred years, and that was followed by the Qing dynasty, where once again some northerners, this time the Man people, Man of Manchuria, take over, so the color is gray again. And although the captains again in the ship of state are not Han Chinese, but the emperors, for example Qianlong, are regarded by Chinese people as legitimate and very good emperors. Near the end of the Qing dynasty, this long cycle of dynastic rule starts to come to an end. It starts to run out of steam. It is becoming corrupted and weak, and the foreigners, the colonial powers, are impinging. They, of course, are not regarded as peoples who are taking over the Chinese ship of state, but rather as countries who are attempting to dismember and take for themselves the resources of China. Russia, Japan, England, France, Germany, etc. were all pushing into China. The green represents internal revolts, so the political stability of the country was very much threatened, and the turmoil trying to establish a republic, the rebellion against the Qing Empire, Qing dynasty, the civil war that followed, the war with Japan. It's a miracle that China could even pull itself together in 1949 and establish itself as a renewed country and close its doors to the foreigners, I think in a way saying enough is enough, we'll lick our wounds and build our own country our own way for a while, thank you very much. And it wasn't until 1978 that Deng Xiaoping opened the door again and allowed, in a cautious and slow fashion, the re-entry of foreigners to China, but this time much more on China's terms. So if we look back, one of the distinctive characteristics of government in China has been its incredible longevity over 3,000 years. It had one center, one leader, had a hierarchical organization. Poets and philosophers were the conscience of this system. Later on in the Tang Dynasty, there were examinations for government service, and the content of the test was looked at your awareness, your understanding of Confucian text, the moral foundation of the system. One of the key concepts in Chinese governance was the mandate of heaven. And I'd like to read this quote from John Fairbank. It says, "While the Zhou dynasty thus continues like the Shang dynasty to use kinship as a main element of political organization, they created a new basis of legitimacy by espousing the theory of heaven's mandate. Where Shang rulers had venerated and sought the guidance of their own ancestors, the Zhou claimed their sanction to rule came from a broader impersonal deity, heaven, whose mandate might be conferred on any family that was morally worthy of responsibility. This doctrine asserted the ruler's accountability to a supreme moral force that guides the human community. Unlike a Western ruler's accession through the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which rested on birth alone, the Chinese theory of heaven's mandate set up a moral criteria for holding power. This moral criteria concept was sustained by Confucius, who lived in the later days of the Zhou dynasty, and in his writings he stressed the moral cultivation of the individual was the foundation for social order and good government. He said, from the Son of Heaven down to the mass of the people, all must consider the cultivation of their person as the root of everything besides. This concept really continues till today, where even the current governments fight, struggling with corruption. The discussion about that is based on moral standards that should be applied to, and punishments that should be applied to correct this problem. The need for moral education is talked about. In the West, the separation of church and state is perhaps an experience unique to the West, which hasn't really happened in China. It wasn't until the late 1800s, early 1900s that there was a questioning of Chinese values and heritage, which I think reached its climax in the Cultural Revolution, where there was an active campaign to stamp out the old traditions and culture of China. This anger with the past was definitely augmented by the shame and embarrassment of having their country occupied for over 100 years, say 1850 to 1950, by foreign countries from all around the world. So this has been a very very brief look at some of the aspects of material resources and potentialities of China, including a look at the arts and sciences and government. I'd like to move on to the next portion, which is Chinese spiritual and philosophical resources. These, of course, include the main religion of China, Buddhism, and two main schools of philosophy, Confucianism and Taoism. In addition, we have to recognize the important role of poets in China. I'd like to read this list, which is a very brief selection of some of China's spiritual concepts and characteristics. There's the love of justice, expressed in the words of its poets and philosophers. There's Taoism, with its belief in harmony through dynamic balance, complementary poles, male, female, material, spiritual, inside, outside, light, dark, logic, intuition, a dynamic balance of these poles of experience. There is a capacity to merge these apparent opposites and resolve these paradoxes. There was an attitude of looking at these things as systems. For example, in the healing of the human body, look at the body as a whole instead of just treating symptoms. There was also the long Confucian tradition that moral order is the foundation of social order and harmony. The well-being of society depends on the spiritual health of the individual. Confucius said if he had to summarize his teachings in one word, it would be reciprocity. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself, he said, his version of the golden rule. In hearing litigation, I feel, like anybody else, the necessity to cause the people to have no litigation. There's an appetite for consensus seeking, not litigation, to resolve conflicts. From Buddhism, China has received high-minded spirituality and a keen sense of the coherence between the material and the spiritual. There's an emphasis on the importance of the group. There's a love of perfection that generated so many centuries of civilized beauty. There's a capacity for obedience. There's open-mindedness, tolerance, a lack of prejudice. There is a love for the practical application of knowledge, the admiration for deeds, not words. There's a great importance given to family relationships, especially respect for parents and elders. There's a belief in the harmony between man and nature, as seen in China's art, much of its poetry, and in particular its garden design. These prefigure the essential concerns of sustainability. There's a belief in tianxia yijia, means all under heaven are one family. There's the concept that freedom should not overstep the boundaries of what is right. There's moderation and there's modesty. If we look a little bit more closely at some of them, poets for example, here's one of China's most famous poets, Du Fu, who said, "Behind the red-painted doors, wine and meat are stinking." This is obviously in the home of the rich. On the wild roads lie corpses of people frozen to death. These are the poor. A hairbreadth divides wealth and poverty. This strange contrast fills me with unappeasable anguish. Obviously a appeal for justice. His poem called "The Roof Whirled Away by Winds." He says, "When will this long night of drizzle come to an end? Now I dream of an immense mansion, tens of thousands of rooms, where all the cold creatures can take shelter, their faces alight, not moved by the wind or the rain, a mansion as solid as the mountain. Alas, when shall I see such a majestic house? If I could see this, even though my poor house were torn down, even though I were frozen to death, I would be content." Again, another cry for justice in the world. From Taoism, two glimpses. No calamity is greater than not knowing what is enough, no fault worse than wanting too much. Whoever knows what is enough has enough. Attachment comes at wasteful cost. Hoarding leads to a certain loss. Knowing what is enough avoids disgrace. Knowing when to stop secures from peril. Only thus can you long last. The sage does not hoard. The more he does for others, the more he has himself. The more he gives, the more he gets. This surely shows a spiritual conception, a sense of the world, the universe as a system in which service and giving are beneficial to the individual. One of the Confucian classic teachings is called the Great Learning. It's like an executive summary of the teachings of Confucius. Every school child for centuries memorized it, and its theme is deeply embedded in Chinese culture. Briefly, it states that the goal of development is to illustrate virtue, to renovate the people, and to rest in the highest excellence. These are development goals. The methods include self-regulation, cultivation and rectification of the individual, and investigation, learning by the individual. It describes a process that relates the internal life of the individual to the health and life of the nation. From the Son of Heaven down to the mass of the people, all must consider the cultivation of their person as the root of everything besides. The investigation of reality by the individual is the fulcrum upon which the inner and outer balance depends. I've made a diagram of this writing called The Great Learning, and it goes something like this. The outer ring, it says, the ancients who wished to illustrate illustrious virtue throughout the empire first ordered well their own states. In order to order well the state, they first regulated the families. In order to order well the families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they first rectified their hearts. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. Such extension of knowledge lay in the investigation of things, the investigation of reality. And here's the turning point of this concept. We've now gone from the need for order at the larger scale, the state or global scale. We've now come to the investigation of reality by the individual. That having been done, their knowledge being complete, their thoughts could be sincere. Thoughts sincere, their hearts could be rectified. Hearts rectified, the persons were cultivated. The persons cultivated, the families could be regulated. The families regulated, the states could be rightly governed. The states rightly governed, the whole empire could be tranquil and happy. So there's this sense of the dynamic balance of the inner and outer worlds. This idea that from the Son of Heaven down to the mass of people, all must consider the cultivation of their person as the root of everything besides, comes from the Great Learning. And if we look at some Baha'i sources, such as the following, the first one, such qualities as trustworthiness, compassion, forbearance, fidelity, generosity, etc., all of these constitute the invisible yet essential foundation of progressive community life. So it's really saying the same thing. The spiritual qualities of the individual need to be developed in order to have progressive community life. Social advancement, we know, arises from the ideals and shared beliefs that weld society together. Meaningful social change results as much from the development of qualities and attitudes that foster constructive patterns of human interaction as from the acquisition of technical capacities. True prosperity, a well-being founded on peace, cooperation, altruism, dignity, rectitude of conduct, and justice, flows from the light of spiritual awareness and virtue, as well as from material discovery and progress. Chinese people reading this would hear some echoes from their own past. My children went to Chinese schools, and one day I was explaining to my son, older boy, when he was about 8 or 9 years old, abdu'l-baha's description of the one child who was slow in his learning but had good behavior, and another child who was brilliant and learning all the sciences and arts but was unruly, had bad behavior. Abdu'l-Baha said that the latter boy, the one with the behavior not so good, could be of potential harm to the society, even though he was learning so much, whereas the child who was not so clever but had good behavior could be of some benefit to society. And then he went on to say, of course, it's best to have both. It's best to have both the good behavior and the well-trained mind. He called that light upon light. And explaining all this to my son quickly said, "Oh, my teacher said the same thing the other day. My teacher said, 我不怕笨,我怕坏," which in a literal translation is, I don't fear stupid, I fear bad. So the teacher was more afraid of bad behavior than she was of a child who was slow in his learning. So a very direct echo of what abdu'l-Baha had been saying. And I was pleased that my son not only understood what I was saying, but that the Chinese school system was more or less saying the same thing. Abdu'l-baha, for example, says, unless the moral character of a nation is educated, as well as its brains and its talents, civilization has no sure basis. Something I'm sure Confucius would wholeheartedly agree with. Here's another comparison of a Confucian statement with something by Abdu'l-baha. Confucius said, in hearing litigation, I feel like anybody else the necessity to cause the people to have no litigation. He was saying that if a relationship descended to the need for litigation, it was a sign of a lack of moral education among the parties involved in the litigation. And Abdu'l-baha pretty much says a similar thing. He said the communities are day and night occupied in making penal laws, preparing instruments and means of punishment. They build prisons, create hardships and tortures. They think by these means to discipline criminals, whereas they are causing destruction of morals and perversion of character. The community, on the contrary, ought day and night to strive and endeavor to accomplish the education of men, to cause them day by day to progress and increase in science and knowledge, to acquire virtues, to gain good morals, and to avoid vices, so that crimes may not occur. Again, statements that Chinese people would recognize as something very familiar. This one's a little bit long, but it's a good one. Here's a discussion about the idea of freedom. Confucius said that at 15, my heart was set on learning. At 30, I stood firm in the society. At 40, I had no more doubts. At 50, I knew the mandate of heaven. At 60, my ear can tell the good from the bad. At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without transgressing the norm. This quotation from Confucius is so well known to Chinese people, they often, instead of referring to someone's age, they refer to this quotation. For example, they say someone in their 30s is is in the stand firm stage of his development. And when someone is in their 40s, they don't say he's in his 40s, they say he's in the huhua stage, the not confused stage. So they know this quotation so well, they can replace the 30s, 40s, 50s, the age of a person, with sections of this quotation. And this sense that freedom should not overstep the boundaries of what is right is also embedded in the Chinese civilization. And it makes the following statements from Baha'i sources, I think, easily understood by Chinese people. For example, the first one, the quality of freedom and of its expression, indeed the very capacity to maintain freedom in a society, undoubtedly depends on the knowledge and training of individuals and on their ability to cope with the challenges of life with equanimity. And this next statement as well would be equally understandable to Chinese people. It says this individual society relationship, so fundamental to the maintenance of civilized life, calls for the utmost degree of understanding and cooperation between society and the individual. Here's another example. If we compare Baha'u'llah's statement that the earth is one country and mankind is citizens, we find in Chinese writings Confucius saying all within the four seas are brothers. And in the year 1000 or so, a Confucian philosopher is saying, heaven is my father and earth is my mother. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. So we can see in Confucianism, we can make many selections that have a resonance with the more contemporary Baha'i writings. If we move on and look at Buddhism, the religion that empowered and propelled Chinese civilization, it's interesting that when Buddhism came to China, it had a form of Buddhism called Mahayana. It's the earlier Buddhism, the Hinayana, is continuous with the Buddhism of the early disciples in emphasizing the necessity of renouncing the world and aggressively pursuing the path of self-conquest. Its spirit ideal is symbolized by the individual who, in self-sufficient homelessness, has overcome the power of craving and has thus gained the unalterable peace of nirvana. Mahayana Buddhism is a movement that arose within Indian Buddhism around the beginning of the Common Era, around the year 0, and became by the 9th century the dominant influence on the Buddhist cultures of Central and East Asia. Mahayana spread from India to Tibet, China, Korea, and Japan, giving rise to various schools. And there's an important difference between the Hinayana and the Mahayana. While the Hinayana practitioner seeks his or her own personal liberation, the Mahayanist wishes to attain enlightenment for the sake of the welfare or benefit of all sentient suffering beings. This is the Buddhism, the Mahayana Buddhism is the one that is dominant in China, and it's one that gives priority to the salvation of the whole society. The influence of Mahayana Buddhism lay in its practice of love and equality, which was an outcome of its fundamental teaching of the unity of all beings, and of its ideal of supreme enlightenment to be attained by all. This enlightenment amounts to realizing the basic unity of existence, the spiritual communion pervading the whole universe. The central idea in Mahayana Buddhist teaching is the gospel of universal salvation based on the idea of the fundamental oneness of all beings. To save oneself by saving others is the gospel of universal salvation taught by Buddhism. Because of one's compassionate concern for others, one's own spiritual peace cannot be perfected as long as salvation has not been universally won. This relationship of the individual to the society at large is this characteristic of Mahayana Buddhism is very much present in Chinese society today. The sense of the group is very strong. The Buddhist impact on China not only had spiritual, social aspects, but also had cultural aspects in terms of architecture and urban planning. And as an architect and planner myself, I'm very interested in a man called Liang Sichang, who was one of the group of architects participating in the design of the United Nations building after the Second World War in New York City. And he wrote a book about the architecture of China called A Pictorial History of Chinese Architecture. And he said in his book that the reader should not be surprised that the overwhelming number of architectural examples presented here are Buddhist temples, pagodas, and tombs. In all times and at all places, religion has provided the strongest impetus to architectural creation. So there's this recognition of the contribution of Buddhism to the creativity of China. Buddhism reached China at approximately the beginning of the Christian era, though there are records of the erection of a Buddhist pagoda as early as the beginnings of the 3rd century AD. We possess today no Buddhist monument before the middle of the 5th century. However, from then on until the later 14th century, the history of Chinese architecture is chiefly the history of Buddhist temples and their pagodas. This is one of the two oldest wooden structures in China. It's from the Tang Dynasty. It was built in 857. This was discovered by Liang Sichang, and he made drawings of it and included them in his book. This is my wife outside a cave in the mountains near Beijing, where a Buddhist monk and his followers carved all of the Buddhist scriptures in stone on the walls of the cave. And my wife commented that the beauty of the letters reflected the devotion of the people carving them. So there was a strong impact of Buddhism in the artistic and architectural aspects of Chinese civilization. So that concludes this very, very brief look at some of the material, cultural, and spiritual resources and potentialities of China. I think we could say we've seen China has a rich artistic expression. Chinese civilization played a key role in science and technology, where China was the most advanced place in the world until around 1400 AD. China has millennia of experience in administering vast territories and large numbers of people, and it has a rich spiritual heritage, a rich experience in the art of living. Let's move on then to part 2 of this presentation, which attempts to answer the question, what are China's material, cultural, and spiritual resources and potentialities for? A short answer for that is social evolution has arrived at the beginning of its maturity to be expressed in a new world order, a global civilization. China has been prepared through its long history to make its own valuable contributions to that order. Of course, every civilization is potentially a contributor to the New World Order. China, with its long history and millennia of experience obviously has much to contribute, and as Shoghi Effendi tells us, is foremost in its resources and potentialities, making China potentially the foremost contributor to the New World Order. Mankind is at a turning point. The Earth's inhabitants are now challenged to draw on their collective inheritance. So all the world's inheritance is now, it's no longer us and them, it's now our inheritance, our collective inheritance. We are challenged to take up consciously and systematically the responsibility for the design of our future. We must erect a social system at once progressive and peaceful, dynamic and harmonious, a system giving free play to individual creativity and initiative, but based on cooperation and reciprocity. The challenge of maturity is to accept that we are one people, to free ourselves from the limited identities and creeds of the past, and to build together the foundations of global civilization. Today, humanity has entered on its collective coming of age, endowed with the capacity to see the entire panorama of its development as a single process. The primary question to be resolved is how the present world, with its entrenched pattern of conflict, can change to a world in which harmony and cooperation will prevail. World order can be founded only on an unshakable consciousness of the oneness of mankind, a spiritual truth to which all the human sciences confirm. So what will China's role be in all of this? Here is a comment by John Fairbank. This noted sinologist, in the introduction to his recent book, China, A New History, refers to China as a latecomer to modernity, and he asks whether China has emerged from isolation just in time to participate in the demise of the world, or, with millennia of survival experience, to rescue it. So here's this famous sinologist, obviously looking to China as a potential source of great contributions to a new world order. Here's a Chinese a social activist, reformer, philosopher called Yan Yangchu. He said, through the last 40 centuries, China must have matured her thought and learned many lessons in the art of living. Maybe China has something to contribute. Surely there must be a better way, a more humane way, of settling international disputes than just by cutting each other's throats. Surely with China's 400 million people, 4,000 years of culture, and vast resources, she must have something to contribute to the peace and progress of mankind. Yan Yangchu, otherwise known as James Yen, was the founder in China of the mass education movement in the 1930s, a rural development education program in a small city called Dingzhou, south of Beijing. In 1943, he was awarded a Copernicus citation on the occasion of the 400th anniversary of Copernicus. The awards were given in Carnegie Hall in New York City to 10 outstanding modern revolutionaries. The others included Albert Einstein, Orville Wright, Henry Ford, and John Dewey. This man was also interviewed by Pearl Buck, and she promoted his work. Song Qingling was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, and she said, "Fraternity is the as yet unrealized ideal of humanity. Liberty has no safe foundation except human brotherhood. Equality can never be anything but a dream until we feel towards each other as brothers. It may be for China to point the way to this fraternity." Napoleon Bonaparte said, "When China moves, she will move the world." For centuries, the Chinese have been a peace-loving people. China, with its multitudinous population and its love of peace, cannot but be instrumental in bringing about universal peace, when rights need not be backed by armies and dreadnoughts. In June 1947, Song Qingling wrote to Nehru saying, referring to the civil war in China and pre-independence convulsions in India, "Perhaps this is the tempering process from which our peoples will emerge with awareness and new spirit for their task in the future civilization." So you can see she too has this sense of a mission for China. Another one, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, while he was living and working in Beijing as a teacher in the early 1920s, he said about China, about Chinese people, "Production without possession, action without self-assertion, and development without domination." And of course we have the statement by Shoghi Effendi, which was reviewed in the first part of this presentation, also claiming for China great potential and capacity. The statement by abdu'l-baha and Shoghi Effendi refer to the future of China. Abdu'l-baha said China is the country of the future. Shoghi Effendi says of China, its future is assuredly bright. And of course the transition from its condition now to that future has many challenges. As with every other country, China will face similar challenges, but will be facing them in its own way and has challenges that are peculiar to China. I would like to review a few of those challenges that China faces on its path to maturity. The first one is materialism. The more China buys into an exclusively material definition of modernization, the less it will see its own potential value, and the harder it will be for it to find its heritage of any relevance to modern life. This issue of buying into this materialistic definition of modernization, of course, challenges many other countries in the world as well. The more the definition of modern excludes the development of our spiritual capacity, the more will China's heritage be overlooked, and the more China will feel like an outsider to the global development process. Is it possible that China has something important to contribute to true modernization? The materialistic definition of modernization is so strong, it not only obscures our understanding of China's spiritual heritage, it also obscures it for Chinese people. It prevents them as well from seeing the potential of their spiritual heritage to make a meaningful contribution to the progress of humanity. Another challenge is corruption. The erosion of honesty, truthfulness, righteousness in administrations and governments around the world is a problem in China as well, and it's openly and publicly addressed and talked about. Here's a cartoon, for example, from a Beijing newspaper. Picture 1 is a well-known Beijing opera character who represents uprightness or honesty. The moon on his forehead is his characteristic symbol. A bribe comes along and masks that moon. It's eclipsed, and he has a new face without his symbol of righteousness. And most people in China understand what this means. Overcoming corruption is obviously a spiritual issue. Another challenge to development is to enhance the dialogue between science and religion. To have this dynamic balance between the material and the spiritual needs to be present in the dialogue, and in its current condition of relative unimportance, it doesn't have much opportunity to participate in such a dialogue. After the 1400s, China lost its leadership in the world in terms of science and technology, but recently has re-embraced science with enthusiasm and even becoming a scientific leader in the world. Science is so important and regarded so highly, it's almost a substitute for religion. China is learning, though, that when words and action are not directed by a moral force, scientific knowledge and technical know-how conduce as readily to misery as they do to prosperity and happiness. China is experiencing many problems now with, you could say, science-assisted crime, white-collar crime, banking crime, computer-assisted crime, etc. So China is being steered through hard experience to re-examine the spiritual aspects of development. Before the 20th century, for most of its history, China never had a strong polarization of religious and scientific thought, and instead of separating church and state, China combined governance with divine authority or philosophy. Also, it has a philosophic tendency to see poles not just as opposites but as boundaries of larger wholes. In contrast, the West has arrived in the modern age with an antagonism between religion and science, and an entrenched separation of church and state that dates back hundreds of years to the days of the Crusades, to the suspicion and hostility of Europe in its dark ages toward the, at that time, superior intellectual and philosophical power of Islam. China may then have fewer historical and intellectual obstacles and be more ready than the West to engage in a dialogue between religion and science. Another challenge in China is to move from an authoritarian social condition to what Dr. Hussein Danesh calls an integrative social condition. The challenge in the West is to move from a more indulgent social condition to the same integrative social condition. This chart is based on one that he made. He designed it in terms of individual characteristics, say an authoritarian person, authoritarian parents, or indulgent people, etc. I'd like to suggest we could think of these characteristics as characteristics of nations or societies as well. Living in China, you often encounter the authoritarian characteristics. Living in the West, you often encounter the indulgent characteristics. Of course, that's an oversimplification, and things are changing. But in general, I think it still holds true. It's helpful when we hear this word authoritarian to think of it more as a stage of growth that has been the predominant one for mankind's growth until recently. We often hear the word used by the Western press in a pejorative sense, for example, referring to various countries as having authoritarian regimes. Instead of finger pointing, I think we have to focus on where both the authoritarian and the indulgent societies have to move to, which is the mature condition. Here it's referred to as the integrative condition, that's growth oriented. Its worldview is unity and diversity. Its emotional and intellectual characteristics center on creativity, and its relationship with others, instead of authoritarian submission or anarchic relationships, are focused on responsibility and cooperation. There have been many times in China when I've been frustrated by the rigidity of the rules and regulations, but on the other hand, many times I've been very grateful for the Chinese habit of obedience. For example, many years ago I was looking for a wife in China, and I decided to go to dancing lessons in the dining hall at the university where I was teaching as a younger man. And the teachers, a man and a woman, were demonstrating various dances, and the students and I were all crowding around watching the performance, trying to hear what the teachers were saying. And as we pressed in, the space for the dancers to dance got less and less and less, until finally they had to stop dancing, and they pushed the students back and created enough space again for them to continue the lesson. They started again, and the students all pressed in again. The circle got smaller and smaller until once again the dancers couldn't teach anymore. Finally, the dance instructors, the man took out a piece of chalk from his back pocket, drew a big circle on the floor, and asked everybody to stand behind that line. That way they had enough room to do their teaching, and everybody could see fairly well. No one in the room crossed that line. It was like an electric fence, although it was just a line on the floor. So once the rule was indicated, everybody followed it. This is just a little cartoon I made of an illustration of authoritarian, power-oriented relations. The two people are playing the competitive game of chess, but they're unaware that the chessboard is now a globe, so that the more I push into the so-called enemy's territory, the more I meet myself. The world has become one, and we can no longer have this dichotomy of us and them. There's only us right now. Another challenge is to establish the equality of men and women. Chairman Mao said, "Women hold up half the sky." And after the establishment of the new China in 1949, the government abolished arranged marriages, allowed women to vote, to have property. They abolished prostitution. They did much to help establish the equality of men and women. In the past, a world ruled by force, where man dominated over women, fitted in with the older authoritarian social structure. But as the scales are shifting and we move towards the so-called integrative mode, women will gain ascendancy, and the spiritual qualities of love and service will be more predominant. Mental alertness, intuition will be stronger. The new age will be less masculine, more feminine. The male and female will be more balanced. Carol Gilligan, a Harvard psychologist, said that men are more burdened with the adolescent attitudes and habits of competition and control. Maturity for a man is autonomy and separation from others, independence and individual achievement. A concern with relationships and cooperation appear as weakness. We can see that a concern with relationships and cooperation are part of the integrative mode. Habits of competition and control are part of the less mature authoritarian mode. Women, therefore, may be more easily able to transition to the integrative mode. Another Boston-based psychologist, Dr. Jean Baker Miller, in her book Towards a New Psychology of Women, said that despite the competitive aspects of any society, there must be a bedrock modicum of cooperation for society to exist at all. It's certainly clear we have not reached a very high level of cooperative living. To the extent that it exists, women have assumed the greater responsibility for providing it. So here again we find the importance of cooperation and cooperative systems, and women have been the primary contributors attempting to create this. Once again, women's experience is more related to the upcoming integrative mode, which will become predominant in the world. The assumption of superiority by man will continue to be depressing to the ambition of women, says abdu'l-baha. Women are still struggling to make their contribution to society as women, and some of them meet great difficulties, perhaps frustrated by authoritarian attitudes, overt or unconscious, of men. In the prosperity of humankind, there's discussion about the need to move on from the current classic economic impersonal market models to models where the motivations are ideals of unity and justice. Society will find itself increasingly challenged to develop these new economic models that arise from a sympathetic understanding of shared experience, from viewing human beings in relation to others, and from a recognition of the centrality to social well-being of the role of the family and the community. These, again, sound very much like the integrative mode. Such an intellectual breakthrough, strongly altruistic rather than self-centered in focus, must draw heavily on both the spiritual and scientific sensibilities of the race, and, I have it in red here, and millennia of experience have prepared women to make crucial contributions to this common effort. I think this would be very encouraging to Chinese women to know this. If China ranks foremost among all nations in material, cultural, and spiritual resources and potentialities, and if Chinese women are advancing more rapidly towards the integrative mode, then perhaps Chinese women are foremost among the foremost. Another challenge that China and the world face is the vast increase in human capacity. One of the causes of the economic boom in China has been the channeling, the releasing of this tremendous energy and capacity. Dr. Arbab, in a book, The Lab, the Temple, and the Market, says that in order to successfully channel this energy, we need corresponding grassroots institutional capacity. He said the creation of the institutions of a global society, a web of interconnected structures that hold society together at all levels, from local to international institutions, that gradually become the patrimony of all the inhabitants of the planet, is for me one of the major challenges of development planning and strategy. Without it, I fear, globalization will be synonymous with the marginalization of the masses. If we go back and look at the Great Learning diagram we looked at earlier, we can see that between the outer layer and the next layer, you go from the state down to the family. It's a big jump. And what is the institutional framework to safely channel and regulate that energy between those two layers? The layer that we could call community is relatively weak, both in China and in the West. A man called Lin Yutang pointed out in his 1935 book, My Country, My People, that this Confucian teaching, the Great Learning, moves through these levels and leaves out community. He said that the jump from state to family is indicative, that unity and loyalty are operative at these two levels, but this sense is weak in between. This was his view of Chinese society. So if we go back to this diagram of the Great Learning, and in between families and the state we add community life, and beyond the state we add the planet. Now we have a more complete, full set of layers. Anyone living in a Chinese city can feel, much as they do in the West, that the cult of individualism is at play. Everyone is, although we're crowded in huge cities and you see many people, in fact we're atomized and the links between us are weak. There aren't strong channels where my needs are known to others and I can get help, or where my talents and capacities are known to others and I can be of service. There's a lack of that dynamic which a vibrant, well-managed community life could nurture and sustain. The Chinese government in the past few years has placed great emphasis on achieving stability and harmony. These activities of building community life, including children's programs for youth, building institutional capacity, learning to consult, etc., are all potentially a great contribution to achieving stability in the society and to absorb creatively and safely this vast increase in human capacity. The next challenge I'd like to look at is environmental sustainability. This, of course, is a major problem in China, and although the Chinese contribution to climate change, for example, on a per capita basis is quite low, China as an aggregate has become a major contributor to global warming, for example. If we see the root cause of environmental problems as an issue of values, as a spiritual problem, then we can see China in fact has something to contribute. We know that the fallacies in theories based on the belief that there is no limit to nature's capacity to fulfill any demand made on it by human beings have now been coldly exposed. A culture which attaches absolute value to expansion, to acquisition, and to the satisfaction of people's wants is being compelled to recognize that such goals are not by themselves realistic guides to policy. Ultimately, only a spiritually based civilization in which science and religion work in harmony will be able to preserve the ecological balance of the earth, foster stability in human population, and advance both the material and the spiritual well-being of all peoples and nations. This perspective on the environmental crisis finds echoes in Chinese philosophy. For example, if we go to the Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, or the Tao as some people call it, the quotes you looked at before, no calamity is greater than not knowing what is enough. No fault worse than wanting too much. Attachment comes at wasteful cost. The sage does not hoard. The more he does for others, the more he has himself. The more he gives, the more he gets. If these attitudes and qualities were put more into practice, we might not have an environmental crisis. The list of challenges could go on, but I'd like to do just one more. This challenge is called the need for a common development vision. The vision that spawned and impelled civilizations are the religions of the world. As their vitality declined, so too the civilization. Each one of them, however, helped humanity advance toward maturity, preparing it for the establishment of a global civilization, the goal of evolution. Our newly emerging one world needs a common faith, one universal cause, to meet the challenges of our new global condition. I've used the plans of the sacred architecture of various civilizations to represent those civilizations. It's interesting to see they all have an axis, a spiritual compass pointing to the divine. I've grouped them in a circle. They're rallying around this new common faith, this new one universal belief system. We all have the bounty to live at a time when all of the civilizations of the world are coming together to form this new world order. Toynbee referred to this process, saying that civilization was an endeavor to create a state of society in which the whole of mankind will be able to live together in harmony as members of a single all-inclusive family. This is, I believe, the goal at which all civilizations so far have been aiming, unconsciously, if not consciously. In the next image we see the rivers of the various civilizations flowing through the centuries, leading to the ocean of the New World Order, of the world community. And in the following slide, if you plot the locations of the manifestations of God, you find that they are the originators of these civilizations. In the case of China, the most recent known religion, Buddhism, the Buddha actually came from India, and then, as we have seen, exerted its influence on China. In North America and Europe, the religion of Christianity actually came from the Middle East and migrated to the West. But in all cases, we can trace civilization's impetus back to a messenger of God. The elements of civilization were all present in China's history. You had a vision which provided the ethical order, which was the roots of the system, which enabled its trunk, a social order, to create branches upon which appeared the fruits of the civilization. But as time went on, the potency of the vision weakened and the vitality of the faith died, hence the need for renewal. Each revelation did two things. It renewed the ethical foundation of civilization, and it provided specific social teachings appropriate for the time in which they were revealed. Gradually, as humanity has matured and we come to this climax in social evolution where we have become one world, we now have the messages of the Bab and Baha'u'llah which address our condition today. In other words, their social teachings focus on the oneness of humanity and how to build a new world order. The Baha'i faith is the youngest of the world's independent religions. Its founder, Baha'u'llah, is regarded by Baha'is as the most recent in the line of messengers of God that stretches back beyond recorded time, and that includes Abraham, Moses, Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster, Christ, and Muhammad. The central theme of Baha'u'llah's message is that humanity is one single race, and that the day has come for its unification in one global society. God, Baha'u'llah said, has set in motion historical forces that are breaking down traditional barriers of race, class, creed, and nation, and that will, in time, give birth to a universal civilization. The principal challenge facing the peoples of the earth is to accept the fact of their oneness and to assist the process of unification. Because humanity is progressing, then the message has to be renewed from time to time. This reformation and renewal of the fundamental reality of religion constitute the true and outworking spirit of modernism. China has a huge appetite to modernize, and they are also searching for what does modernization mean. This translation of the renewed reality into the life of the world around us is here called modernism. This is what modernization really means. Being anxiously concerned about the needs of the age in which we live and endeavoring to apply the new revelation to the society around us has the spirit of modernism. Who is ready to build the new world order? What is the condition of those approaching this challenge? If we arrange around the task of building together the foundations of global civilization, the qualities and attitudes that we see in the world around us, we get quite a variety. We have everything from hope to despair, a sense of purpose, magnanimity, doubt and fanaticism, truth-seeking, etc. If we look at what China has to offer, abdu'l-baha said that the Chinese people are prompted with ideal motives. They are simple-hearted. They are truth-seeking. They are free from deceit and hypocrisies. I think many people who have lived here find Chinese people are also open-minded, exhibit tolerance, flexibility, moderation. Surely these qualities and attitudes are welcome as we face this task together of building the foundations of a global civilization. As China becomes more and more involved with other nations, it can, through its own example and its concerted efforts to foster world peace, become a most effective participant in the development of a new world civilization. China does not need to follow the same path already trodden by other nations. It can open a new path that will lead it directly to an honored position in a new world order that China itself will have helped to build. It may be a confirmation and a joy lifting the hearts of the Chinese people to find so much of their vast cultural, philosophical, and spiritual heritage is in tune with the genuine requirements of this new age, to find that they have valuable contributions to make to true modernization. I'd like to offer in conclusion these words of abdu'l-baha, which I think help define true modernization. He says, O thou provider, the dearest wish of this servant of thy threshold is to behold the friends of East and West in close embrace, to see all the members of human society gathered with love in a single great assemblage, even as individual drops of water collected in one mighty sea, to behold them all as birds in one garden of roses, as pearls of one ocean, as leaves of one tree, as rays of one sun. Although this look at China's material, cultural, and spiritual resources and potentialities has been very brief, I think we saw enough to begin to understand what abdu'l-baha and Chogyam Effendi are saying about China. This subject is complex and vast. If anyone hearing this has any comments, recommendations, additions, corrections, please let me know. Thank you very much for listening.